Picture this. A league that's been fighting for mainstream attention for decades finally gets exactly what it wanted. Sold-out arenas, prime-time coverage, sponsorship deals flooding in. Casual fans who never watched women's basketball suddenly tuning in every night. You'd think everyone would be celebrating, right? Instead, certain voices decided the problem wasn't the lack of attention anymore. It was who brought it. For months, Caitlin Clark has been treated like a glitch in the system rather than the system upgrade she actually is. The criticism hasn't been normal either. We're talking about claims that shift every time someone checks the facts. Accusations that sound technical until you actually look at the numbers. A pattern of downplaying that's gone on so long it stopped feeling like basketball analysis and started feeling like something else entirely. But then Cheryl Miller stepped into the conversation and everything changed. She didn't offer polite disagreement or diplomatic both sides commentary. She called it what it is. Noise built on misinformation, dressed up as expert opinion. And when a legend speaks that plainly, people have no choice but to listen. What she said next didn't just defend Clark. It exposed the entire game being played around her. The playbook against Caitlin Clark has been surprisingly consistent, even when the facts aren't. It starts with something that sounds legitimate, gets repeated across platforms, then quietly falls apart the moment anyone bothers to verify it. First came the age narrative. Critics suggested Clark had some unfair advantage because she was older than her competition, implying she'd gamed the system by staying in college longer than normal. It's the kind of claim that works because it sounds like insider knowledge, like understanding eligibility. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a video. Rules that casual fans don't follow, except the timeline doesn't support it. Clark followed a standard 4-year college path. She didn't exploit COVID rules to pad stats. She didn't take a 5th year. The insinuation was built on air, but it spread anyway because it gave people permission to add an asterisk to her accomplishments. When that angle stopped working, the target shifted to shot volume. Suddenly, the conversation became about how she's just a chucker taking 40 shots a game, forcing her teammates into spectator roles while she hunts for highlights. The framing painted her as selfish, as someone whose numbers are empty because they come at her team's expense. Cheryl Swoopes pushed this narrative hard, claiming Clark's style wouldn't translate to the pros, that WNBA vets wouldn't tolerate that kind of usage. The problem is, the actual number was 22.7 shots per game during her senior season. That's high volume, sure, but it's also what elite primary scorers do when they're carrying offensive systems. And here's where it gets awkward. Swoopes herself averaged 19.2 shots per game in her senior year at Texas Tech. That's only 3 fewer attempts. Nobody called her selfish. Nobody said her game was empty. The difference in how identical situations get framed tells you everything about what's actually happening here. Then came the record chase. When Clark closed in on becoming the NCAA's all-time leading scorer, the question wasn't whether she'd done something historic. It was whether the record should even count. The claim? She had extra time, extra eligibility, extra advantages that made the achievement less legitimate than those who came before her. Once again, the facts didn't cooperate. She broke the record in 4 years, just like the players whose names were already in the book. But the narrative survived anyway, because the goal was never accuracy. It was diminishment. Let's sit with that shot volume criticism for a second, because it's the clearest example of how selective memory rewrites basketball history. When Cheryl Swoopes says Caitlin Clark takes too many shots, she's making a judgment that sounds like it's rooted in team-first principles. The implication is that real stars don't need that many attempts, that elite players make their teammates better without dominating the ball. It's a talking point that lands well in podcasts and debate shows because it taps into an archetype we all recognize, the selfish gunner who cares more about stats than wins. Except Clark's game doesn't fit that mold, and the comparison to Swoopes makes the whole argument collapse. Clark averaged 22.7 shots per game during her final college season. Swoopes averaged 19.2 during hers. That's a difference of 3.5 attempts. Not 10, not 15, 3.5 shots across 40 minutes of basketball. And context matters here, because those extra attempts weren't wasted possessions. Clark shot efficiently, created open looks for teammates off the attention she drew, and still averaged over 8 assists per game throughout her college career. When you're bending defenses to the point where double teams start at half court, your teammates get better shots whether you pass or shoot. That's not selfish basketball. That's gravity. But there's a bigger issue hiding underneath the shot count debate. When a legend like Swoopes needed 19 shots a night to carry Texas Tech, it was understood as necessity. The offense ran through her because she was the best option, and nobody questioned whether that made her a bad teammate. The standard was simple: great players take and make big shots. That's how you win games, when the talent gap narrows and the pressure rises. So why does the same usage rate become a character flaw when it's Clark? Why does her volume get framed as a problem that needs to be solved rather than a reflection of her role? The answer is uncomfortable, but it's also obvious. The criticism was never about the shots. It was about controlling the narrative around who gets to be celebrated and on what terms. When you can't deny the production, you question the process. When you can't challenge the results, you move the goalposts and hope nobody notices. Except people did notice. And one of them was Cheryl Miller. The assault on Caitlin Clark's NCAA scoring record might be the most telling example of how far critics were willing to stretch just to avoid giving her full credit. When she passed Kelsey Plum to become the all-time leading scorer in Division I history, the response from certain voices wasn't celebration or even neutral acknowledgement. It was a question: does this even count? Cheryl Swoopes led that charge, arguing that if you're going to break a record legitimately, you need to do it in the same amount of time as the person who set it. The logic sounded reasonable on the surface, the kind of purist take that appeals to people who care about context and era comparisons. But the foundation was rotten because the premise was false. Clark broke the record in 4 seasons. Not 5, not 6, 4 years of college basketball, the same time frame that every other player in the conversation used to build their legacy. Yes, the COVID eligibility rule existed, and yes, it gave players the option to return for an extra season without penalty. But Clark didn't use that option. She didn't need a 5th year to pad her numbers or chase history. She got there in the standard amount of time, under the standard structure, against defenders who knew exactly what she was trying to do every single night. The extra year narrative was fiction, but it spread because it gave people a way to dismiss the accomplishment without sounding overtly biased. What made the whole thing worse was the casual delivery. Swoopes admitted on the podcast that she didn't even know what the record number was. She questioned its legitimacy without knowing the details, which tells you the criticism wasn't coming from informed analysis. It was coming from somewhere else. And that's the part that stuck with people, not just Clark's fans, but anyone paying attention to how narratives get shaped in real time. When you're willing to challenge a historic achievement without bothering to check the basic facts, you're not doing commentary. You're doing something closer to propaganda. The record stands. The timeline is clear. The attempts to reframe it as something less than what it was have been thoroughly debunked. But the effort to diminish it in the first place revealed something important. Some people were never going to be comfortable with Caitlin Clark becoming the face of women's basketball, no matter what she accomplished or how she did it. When Cheryl Miller finally addressed the Caitlin Clark discourse, she didn't ease into it with careful language or both sidesism. She walked onto the All the Smoke podcast and delivered one of the most direct takedowns of the anti-Clark narrative that anyone with her stature has offered. And the key phrase, the one that immediately went viral, wasn't packaged as a hot take or designed for clicks. It was just honest frustration from someone who'd watched the circus long enough. "Come on, you big dummies." The room erupted in laughter, but Miller wasn't joking. She was calling out the laziness, the bad faith arguments, and the refusal to engage with what was actually happening on the court. She was saying what a lot of people had been thinking but didn't have the platform or the credibility to say out loud. Miller's voice carries a different weight than most because her basketball resume is unimpeachable. She's a Naismith Hall of Famer, a former USC legend who dominated college basketball in a way that changed how people viewed the women's game. A pioneer who played professionally when opportunities were scarce and became a broadcaster who's respected across the entire sport. When she speaks, people don't just listen because she's famous. They listen because she's earned the authority to evaluate talent at the highest level, and she doesn't waste that authority on shallow takes or manufactured drama. What made her defense of Clark even more credible was the context. Miller had just coached the 2024 WNBA All-Star Game, which meant she'd spent real time with Clark in a competitive environment. She wasn't talking about someone she'd only seen on highlight reels or through media narratives. She'd worked with her, watched her prepare, seen how she interacted with teammates, how she processed information, how she approached high-pressure situations. That first-hand access gave Miller insights that no podcast critic or retired player commenting from a distance could match. And she didn't hold back. Miller made it clear that the version of Clark being sold by her critics, the selfish, overrated, media-created star, didn't match the player she'd actually coached. She praised Clark's basketball IQ, her vision, her work ethic, and most importantly, her authenticity. Miller wasn't just defending Clark's talent, she was defending her character, pushing back against the insinuation that the hype was manufactured or that the attention was undeserved. That's what made the moment resonate beyond typical player versus critic drama. One of the most revealing parts of Cheryl Miller's commentary wasn't about stats or shot charts. It was about what she witnessed emotionally during Caitlin Clark's rookie season, particularly in those brutal early weeks when the Indiana Fever were struggling and the pressure was suffocating. Miller described a moment that didn't make highlight reels but said everything about what Clark was carrying. After the Fever finally secured their first win of the season, Miller found Clark and embraced her. It wasn't a casual congratulations or a quick sideline hug. It was the kind of moment that happens when someone who understands the weight finally offers relief. And according to Miller, Clark's reaction told the whole story. The emotion wasn't just about winning, it was about surviving. Think about what that first stretch must have felt like. Clark entered the WNBA with more attention than any rookie in league history, which sounds like a blessing until you realize it also means every turnover gets analyzed, every loss gets blamed on her, and every struggle becomes proof to critics that they were right all along. She was trying to adjust to faster defenders, tighter spacing, and a league where every team had scouted her for months. She was learning a new system with new teammates, while also being treated like the answer to all of Indiana's problems. And on top of all that, she had voices like Cheryl Swoopes publicly questioning whether she even belonged, whether her game would translate, whether the hype was real. Miller saw all of that. And instead of keeping her distance or offering generic encouragement, she stepped in as a mentor. She told Clark to be proud, to savor the win, to use it as a blueprint for what's possible. But the most important thing she said was simple: keep being you. That's not a throwaway line. It's a directive from someone who knows what happens when young stars start second-guessing themselves under pressure. They shrink. They edit their instincts. They try to become what critics want instead of what makes them special. Miller was telling Clark not to fall into that trap, to trust the very things that got her to this level, even when the noise tries to convince her otherwise. That relationship matters because it's built on something real. Clark isn't just getting advice from a legend. She's getting it from someone who genuinely sees her, understands the isolation that comes with being the center of attention, and refuses to let the narrative break her. Cheryl Miller's most surprising admission wasn't about Caitlin Clark individually. It was about the Indiana Fever as a whole. She expected the talent level to be solid, because you don't make it to the WNBA without serious skill. What caught her off guard was the basketball IQ across the roster. The way Indiana's young core processed the game in real time, communicated on both ends, and understood not just what to do, but why. That's a distinction most fans miss, because it doesn't show up in box scores, but coaches recognize it immediately. Teams with high basketball IQ don't just run plays. They adjust mid-possession. They recognize coverages early. They make the right read when the defense takes away the first option. Miller was essentially saying, the Fever are further along mentally than their record suggested. And that kind of foundation is what separates teams that compete from teams that contend. When Miller talked about Clark specifically, the praise went beyond the scoring or even the assist numbers. She focused on vision, on the way Clark sees the floor almost like a three-dimensional game unfolding in front of her, while everyone else is working in 2 dimensions. That's not coach speak. That's identifying a trait that only a handful of players in any generation actually possess. Elite scorers are valuable. Elite passers can organize an offense. But a player with rare vision changes everyone's job because she creates opportunities that weren't there a second ago, finds teammates in windows that shouldn't exist, and manipulates defenses just by where she looks. Miller also highlighted something that flies under the radar in all the discourse: Clark's defensive improvement. A lot of critics assumed she'd be a liability on that end, that teams would hunt her in pick and roll and expose her as one-dimensional. What Miller saw was a player who competed, who understood positioning, who worked within the team's scheme instead of freelancing. That's maturity. And it's exactly the kind of development that turns good teams into dangerous ones, because when your best offensive player also buys in defensively, it sets a standard for everyone else. The broader point Miller kept circling back to was this: Indiana isn't just riding one player's talent. They're building a system around pace, spacing, and decision-making that fits the modern game. If they continue adding pieces that complement that identity, they're not a few years away from contention. They're a lot closer than people think. And Clark isn't just the centerpiece. She's the accelerant. Here's the part that makes the entire Cheryl Swoopes saga so uncomfortable. It's not just that she got facts wrong or that her criticisms didn't hold up under scrutiny. It's that the pattern kept repeating even after being corrected, and the framing stayed negative even when she claimed there was no bias. On multiple occasions, Swoopes insisted she didn't dislike Caitlin Clark, that she was just offering honest basketball analysis, that people were misinterpreting her intent. But when every single comment about Clark involves downplaying her achievements, questioning her legitimacy, or predicting she'll struggle, the disclaimer starts to ring hollow. Intent doesn't matter much when the impact is consistent diminishment. What made it worse was the context around some of these moments. Swoopes would go on podcasts, speak casually about Clark's game, throw out incorrect stats, then move on without correction. The 40 shots per game claim, the age and eligibility misunderstanding, the suggestion that the scoring record shouldn't count. These weren't one-time slips. They were repeated talking points that created a false narrative. And that narrative spread because Swoopes has a platform and a Hall of Fame legacy that makes casual listeners assume she's done her homework. Except she hadn't. And when people started pointing that out, the response wasn't accountability. It was defensiveness. The shift in broadcasting assignments for certain fever games became its own storyline because of this credibility gap. It wasn't about silencing criticism or protecting Clark from tough analysis. It was about whether someone who repeatedly gets basic facts wrong should be the primary voice covering the league's biggest story. Fans noticed. The league noticed. And eventually, the decision was made to bring in other voices for key matchups, which sent a message: analysis is welcome, but misinformation dressed up as expertise isn't. That's the contrast Cheryl Miller's comments created. Miller came in with first-hand knowledge, specific observations, and a willingness to be direct without distorting reality. She praised Clark's strengths, acknowledged the challenges, and called out the bad faith criticism for what it was. Swoopes came in with assumptions, shifting narratives, and a pattern that made people question whether basketball analysis was ever really the point. One approach builds credibility, the other destroys it. And once credibility is gone, it doesn't matter how many disclaimers you add. People stop listening to the words and start watching the pattern. The pattern told the whole story. The most important thing Cheryl Miller's defense did wasn't just validate Caitlin Clark. It reframed how we should be thinking about the Indiana Fever's future. For most of Clark's rookie season, the narrative was about growing pains, about whether she could adjust, about how long it would take for the pieces to fit. That framing assumes a slow build, a patient process where expectations stay modest, while the young core figures things out over multiple seasons. Miller's comments suggest that timeline might be wrong. When a legend looks at a roster and describes them as fearless, when she's genuinely surprised by their collective basketball IQ, when she talks about a team that competes without flinching, she's not selling hope. She's identifying the raw materials that championship teams are built from. Indiana's early struggles weren't about talent or potential. They were about chemistry, timing, and the chaos that comes with integrating a generational rookie into a system that's still finding its identity. But once that first win came, something shifted. The Fever started playing with more cohesion. Defensive rotations tightened. Role players found their spots. And Clark began to look less like someone trying to survive and more like someone ready to dominate. By the end of her rookie year, the numbers were undeniable. 19.2 points per game, 8.4 assists, leading the entire league in playmaking, while also being one of the most efficient scorers in her draft class. That's not a player who needs more time to develop. That's a player who's already arrived. The question now isn't whether Indiana can build around Clark. It's how quickly they can add the pieces that turn a talented roster into a legitimate title threat. If they bring in another scoring option to take pressure off, if they add defensive versatility in the front court, if they continue developing the chemistry that started clicking late in the season, this team doesn't need 3 or 4 years to compete. They need 1 or 2 smart off-season moves and some continuity. Miller's belief in their foundation isn't based on potential. It's based on what she saw in practice, in games, in moments when the pressure was highest, and Indiana didn't blink. That's the real story here. Not whether Caitlin Clark is good enough. She is. Not whether the criticism was fair. It wasn't. The real story is that the Fever are ahead of schedule, and the people who understand basketball at the highest level are starting to say it out loud. The loudest part of this entire saga was never the basketball. It was the refusal to accept what was happening right in front of everyone. A generational talent entered the league, brought unprecedented attention, and immediately produced at an elite level. And instead of recognizing that for what it was, certain voices spent months finding new ways to discredit it. The age wasn't right. The shots were too many. The record didn't count. The style wouldn't translate. Every time one narrative collapsed, another one appeared. Because the goal was never honest evaluation. It was control over who gets celebrated and on whose terms. Cheryl Miller didn't just defend Caitlin Clark. She exposed that entire game. She made it impossible to keep pretending the criticism was rooted in basketball analysis when it kept contradicting basic facts. And in doing so, she created permission for everyone else to stop playing along. Clark doesn't need acceptance from the people who spent her rookie year trying to diminish her. She's already forcing the league to adapt to her, not the other way around. The Fever aren't waiting their turn. They're building something real. And the next chapter isn't about whether Clark belongs. It's about who can actually stop what she's building. Stay locked in with my channel, Simply Explained. Your home for the truth behind the WNBA headlines.